Welcome back, guys. Having trouble in understanding Incoterms? While you look at it on every invoice and you don't understand what does this mean? I'm going to explain it to you in a very easy way so that you can comprehend what does this mean and what are the risks incorporated in each one of these terms that you should know. So let's have a look at Incoterms. But first and foremost, if you recall this chart, very simple, very easy, and it often comes on your computers, on your manuals as well when you're getting some trainings. But it's hard to understand, huh? So we'll go through one by one all of these categories and I will make you understand what each one of these mean. What are Incoterms? Incoterms are an internationally recognized set of terms that defines responsibilities and obligations of the parties involved in the transport of goods. Incoterms are used to clearly communicate the division of the cost of delivery of goods between the seller and the buyer. A common set of rules and guidelines for interpreting the most commonly used terms in foreign trade. Incoterms are revised periodically, roughly every 10 years, by the ICC to conform to changing trade practices. So, what Incoterms do? It is important to note that Incoterms of a contract for sale pertain only to the delivery terms. Carriage freight cost, for example, and insurability of the product. Incoterms define the respective obligations, costs, and risks involved in the delivery of goods. So Incoterms by themselves do not specify the amount of the contract or the terms of financing. So no seal of receivable connection. They do not supersede the law governing the contract. They also do not address the transfer of ownership of the goods. They do not determine when to recognize the revenue. They also do not address the consequences of a breach of contract and exemptions of liability. The items are defined by the terms of the sale contract and governed by the law. So these are few common misunderstandings we have when it comes to Incoterms. For your convenience, I have categorized them into 4 major categories that you see on your screen. The first one is E category, where I've put Ex Works, departure mainly. The second one is pre-carriage. I've put all the F there, FCA, FAS, FOB. The third one is main carriage, where I've put all the C categories, CRF, CIF, CPT, and CIP. And the last one is on carriage, that is DAP, DPU, and TDP. Now we'll go through each of these groups. So pay attention to how we go through them, and if we go step by step, category by category, I assure you, you will easily understand what are the major traits of these Incoterms and what are the basic differences as well amongst these categories. So let's start with Group E. First and foremost in Group E, we have Ex Works. This term represents the seller's minimum obligation, as the seller only has to make the goods available to its location. The seller does not load the goods on the collecting vehicle and do not clear the goods for export as well. The buyer bears all the costs of transfer, of export and import duties and cargo insurance as well. Also, the risk of bringing the goods to their final destination. The buyer also carries out all custom formalities in this case. In Group F, the first one in Group F is FCA, free carrier. The seller delivers the goods to the carrier and clears the goods for export. Once the goods have been delivered to the carrier, the buyer takes over all the cost and risks. The buyer is responsible for procuring and paying for cargo insurance and all import formalities. FCA is the most commonly used Incoterm. It is used approximately 40% of all the international trade shipments. FCA is one of the most favorable terms for the buyer who wants to have control over the cost at origin and international transportation through the nominated freight forwarders as well. The next one is FAS, free alongside ship. In this case, the seller delivers the goods alongside the vessel at the named port of the shipment and is required to clear the goods for export. The risk of loss of or damage to the goods passes to the buyer when the goods are alongside the vessel. The buyer bears all the costs from the moment forwarded, including the loading of cargo on the vessel, and is responsible for procuring the cargo insurance and carrying out all the import formalities. This term can only be used for ocean or inland waterway supplies or transportations. The next one in this category is FOB, free on board. The seller in this case delivers the goods to the vessel nominated by the buyer, loads the good on board on the ship and clears the good for export. The risk of loss of or the damage to the goods passes when the goods are on board or on the vessel, and the buyer bears all the costs from the moment onward, including cargo insurance, etc. The buyer is responsible for all import formalities. This term can be used for ocean and inland waterway transportations. The FCA term was changed to allow the parties to agree on issuing a bill of lading, BOL, to the seller once the goods arrive on the port. Then let's move on to Group C. In Group C, the first category is CFR, cost and freight. In this case, the seller arranges the shipments and pays for the goods to be delivered to the final port of destination. The seller is responsible for clearing the goods for export. As the risk of loss or of the damage to the goods passes to the buyer when the goods are loaded on board the vessel. The buyer is responsible for procuring and buying the cargo insurance. The buyer is also responsible for all import formalities. This term can be used for ocean and inland waterway transportation. The buyer is responsible for all import formalities as well. This term can be used only for ocean and inland waterway transportation. CIF, cost, insurance and freight. The seller arranges transportation. CIF, cost, insurance and freight. The seller arranges transportation and pays for the goods to be delivered to the final port of destination. The seller is responsible for clearing the goods for export. As the risk of loss of or damage to the goods passes to the buyer when the goods are loaded on board on the vessel. The buyer is responsible for procuring and buying the cargo insurance. The buyer is also responsible for all import formalities. In this case, this term can be used for ocean and inland waterway transportation. CPT, carriage paid to. In this case, the seller clears the goods for export and buys the pre-carriage and main carriage to be named place of destination. The seller may pay on carriage costs, which should be noted in the contract. The buyer is responsible for procuring cargo insurance and handling all import formalities. This term has two very critical points, because the risk passes and costs are transferred at different places. First, the risk passes once the goods have been delivered to the nominated carrier at the agreed place of shipment at the origin. And second, the named place of destination to which the seller must contract the carriage. CIP, carriage and insurance paid. In this case, the seller clears the goods for export and pays pre-carriage and main carriage to the named place of destination. The seller may pay a carriage cost, which should be noted very well in the contract. This term has been updated to require the seller to purchase nearly maximum insurance coverage, that is equivalent to Clause A of Institute of Cargo Clauses. The risk passes to the buyer when the goods are loaded in the first truck. The buyer is responsible for all the import formalities. Then let's move on to Group D. The first one in Group D is DAP, delivered at place. The seller pays for carriage to the named place of destination and assumes all the risks until the goods are ready to be unloaded by the buyer. The buyer is responsible for all costs related to import clearance. Unloading is the responsibility of buyer in this case. DAP, delivery at place. The seller pays for carriage to the named place of destination and assumes that all risks until the goods are ready for loading by the buyer. The buyer is responsible for all costs related to import clearance. Unloading is responsibility of buyer in this case. DPU. DPU replaces the DAT term. The seller clears the goods for export and pays for pre-carriage. Main carriage and on-carriage costs, the buyer is responsible for all import clearance formalities. DAP is only Incoterm, explicitly tasking the seller with unloading. DDP, delivery duty paid. This term represents the maximum obligation to the seller. The seller is responsible for delivering the goods to the named place of destination. The destination place, seller bears all the costs and risks involved in bringing the goods to the place of destination and has an obligation to clear the goods for export and import and carry out all custom formalities, including the payment of all duties, taxes, custom fees, etc. The parties are advised not to use DDP if the seller is unable to directly or indirectly obtain import clearance. I will take you back to that traditional chart, but this time we'll go one by one to understand each one of the categories. So the first one, as I explained in detail, Ex Works. This is most favorable for the seller, as you can see, because the risk transfer, and on the chart you can see from your left hand side the equipment is being produced and then sent throughout till the end of right hand side. It is reaching the buyer. That is how this chart works. So as you can see, the seller has the best, I will say, feasible situation when it comes to Ex Works, because right after production the risk transfer and obligations are transferred very quickly before the first carrier. In the next one, FCA, free carrier, you can see a little bit further the risk transfers are being carried on and also obligations are transferred a bit delayed. In FAS, you can see it is even further, and alongside ship the risk transfer is done, also the obligations are transferred to the buyers. In FOB, you can see it's even further. After loading on the port, the risk is transferred and obligations are also moved. Whereby now we're coming to the CFR, where you can see that at the destination port the obligations are being transferred, whereby the risk was transferred at the loading port. In CAF, nothing different. The basic difference between CFR and CIF is that both are more or less similar terms that relate to transporting of goods by sea, where the primary responsibility lies with the seller, particularly in the cost of shipping and freight. The difference between these two is that CIF requires marine insurance to be included, paid by the seller. That provides protection against any damage of the goods. Then comes the CPT and CIP as well. Effectively, again, both of them are same as CPT, except that the seller is required to obtain the insurance for the goods during the transit. CIP also covers the mode of transformation, while CIF is very specifically for sea freight. Now, DPU, DAP, you can see the difference between both of them. In case of DAP, the risk transfer is quite late, and also the obligations are transferred pretty late in that case. Whereby the DDP, that looks pretty similar to DAP. Under DDP, the buyer is only responsible for unloading. The seller is responsible for everything else, including packing, labeling, freight, customs, clearance, duties, and taxes. Under DAP, the buyer is responsible for not only the unloading, but the customs clearance, duties, and taxes as well. So this chart shows in more detail how the responsibilities and metrics of the contract of sale is working. So I hope with these 4 categories you are able to better understand how these Incoterms are categorized and what are more favorable for sellers and what are more favorable for buyers. So these are a few classifications that help to understand more on a high level, to categorize these and classify these according to the risk and responsibilities. Putting Incoterms into practice. So when it comes to putting the Incoterms in practice, I have some recommendations for all of you. First of all, identify what Incoterms your business usually uses. Check to see if the changes introduced by Incoterms has any impact on your business. Consider if you are using the right Incoterms. Many businesses continue to use an Incoterm which is no longer suitable or relevant to their business needs. And update your contracts to refer to the right Incoterms. Be specific. When using Incoterms in a contract of sale or a purchase order, identify the appropriate Incoterm rule like FCA, CIP, DDP, etc., etc. Specify the place or port as precisely as possible and state Incoterm reference as well. For example, FCA, specific airport in Boston, etc., etc. Understand who has the responsibility of loading and unloading charges. For example, for DAP, DPU, and DDP terms, the seller is obliged to place the goods on the carrier, which will deliver the goods on the named place of destination. The buyer is responsible for unloading. For CPT, CIP, and CFR or CIF terms, the seller completes the delivery when the goods reach the port of the destination. Once the goods have been delivered to the agreed upon port or place, the buyer then takes over the responsibility from that point forward. And under FCA, the seller's obligations are satisfied once the goods have been handed over to the carrier named in the buyer at the place agreed. So the buyer is responsible for inland freight, unloading and at the port of origin, and loading on the ocean carrier or airline. And know where the risk transfer is coming into play. For X work, risk transfer at the seller's facility or at the agreed place, which is typically with the first truck. And Similarly, we have different risk transfers as we have seen for each one of the categories. Where to get the copy of these Incoterms? Very simple. I have put the link below in the section of description. You can find it over there, and you can familiarize yourself with each one of these categories. If you have any question or comment, please put it down in the comment section and I'll try to get back to you as soon as possible. Sharing is caring, so it helps others as well to learn from you. Once again, thank you very much for joining today. Please do subscribe if you're a first-time joiner on this channel, and do share it with your friends and your colleagues. I hope to speak to you soon. Till then, take very good care of yourself and stay safe. Bye-bye.